So I'm the Director of Intercultural Programs. I do diversity work there, and this is my 4th year in that role. But also, I think Rich mentioned if you do want to write down questions, I'm just probably going to ask one or two myself. If you have questions, just hold up your sheet of paper, and some of my students are around, and they'll come grab it from you and bring them up. Thanks. So write those down now. Great. I'm just going to jump in. This is great for me because I do racial diversity work at a Christian college campus. And I wrestle with a lot of questions myself, and I have some experts here that can maybe shed some light on these things that keep me up at night that I struggle with. So, great. This first question I think is actually relevant to Soong-Chan, some of what you just shared, and that is, what motivates us to pursue reconciliation. My question specifically is, how would you encourage Christians who approach racial reconciliation that is motivated by guilt or to appease guilt?
Yeah. And I'm going to say officially that I would like to actually officially do away with the word white guilt. I think it's unproductive, it's unhelpful. Check. Are we on? Okay, I think we're on. I would like to officially do away with the word white guilt. It's unproductive, it's unhelpful. One, it's not just the kind of specificity of it, but the idea of guilt is too simplistic. Guilt in the Western construct is usually an individual experience. So an individual feels guilty about having a negative thought about a different race 15 years ago. So in order to absolve yourself of that guilt, you're going to definitely not work on King Holiday this year. You're going to go shopping instead. So you do a positive act to counteract the negative act. That's usually what guilt implies. You want to do away with that individual feeling of guilt by doing something positive instead. And that, I think, minimizes what the problem is. So I actually prefer kind of the Eastern concept of shame, which is that even though it might have been one person or group of people, the entire community is experiencing it. It's not just the guilt of the individual, but it's the shame of the community. So even as I'm speaking about a lot of these issues, I feel ashamed as an American Christian, as a pastor of a church, as a student of history. I feel ashamed that transcend race at times. To say, actually there's something very deep that's happening in my community, and how am I contributing to that corporate sinfulness? Now if I just felt guilt, I was like, well, I'll just make a good African-American friend and I'm done with it. That's what guilt might lead to, but shame goes much deeper than that.
Not everyone has to respond. Great. My next question, this is actually very relevant to us as we approach an election year. And some of you have alluded to it and maybe intentionally talked a little bit around it, but this is just something that I know comes up in my work. My question is, how do you reconcile a passion for multicultural advocacy with the existing strong association with evangelical faith and conservative politics? This is one that keeps me up at night because I work at Westmont College and it just seems to be pervasive. And I'll be honest with you, I'm looking for strong voices in, and I don't want to make this about politics, but in conservative circles that are engaging in the conversation around race effectively. And that's been a challenge for me. So I wanted to see how you can make sense of that existing within the evangelical subculture reality in churches, but also institutions of Christian faith.
One thing to say about that. Is this on?
Yeah.
Okay. Since I teach a couple of classes, political science classes, I think one reason Christians have lost their moral voice is because we didn't speak up enough in the civil rights period, and we continue to not do that enough. But issues of race and ethnicity, immigration, some of those things are quote-unquote left issues. I mean, I don't think they shouldn't be, but that's how they're perceived. But we can speak into those things because, as Soong-Chan said, those are biblical values. We see all sorts of biblical support for those things. So we can engage on those issues, get some moral authority, and then we can speak on more some of the issues that are on the right that are important to us, like life issues, those sorts of things. So that's one way. And so I always talk to my students, I go, what if I was completely pro-life? So I'm for the unborn, I'm for the living. I'm not just pro-birth. I'm trying to get care of prenatal care, postnatal care, and all that. And I care about the environment. I care about refugees, this whole thing. Would you vote for me? You know, and they all say, I've never heard that before. You know, that would be a great platform. Of course, I could never get elected because the money's all on the extremes. But I'd love for the church to stand up and embrace that holistic gospel and get into all those issues. And so I'm encouraging folks to speak up on those quote-unquote left issues as a way of getting a voice in some of the other ones.
I want Soongchan to have the last word, so I'll just say that I used to understand conservative Christian thinking. I grew up in a Pentecostal church, which is in the black culture a very conservative, right-leaning church around holiness. And so I really have grown up in a very conservative understanding of social issues because my church really very much values the piety. And so by show of hands, anybody, you know what I'm talking about, that notion of growing up in a very, almost legalistic. What confuses me now is when I see Liberty University and other conservative Christian colleges and Christian communities. At one point, what made sense to me was if you were a sinner, if you were divorced, if you had had an affair, for my church, that disqualified you from leadership because holiness mattered to us. And we held everybody to a very high standard of purity. So it not being married mattered to us. What's confusing to me is how that changes. I don't understand Donald Trump. I don't, not because of his anything other than to say, at one point, if you had an affair and it was public, my church's conservative Christian values said, we're looking for somebody who is moral, that we look up to. So that confuses me. I honestly don't understand what happened to the church I grew up in that had a narrative that at least was consistent. You sin, we're standing against that because we want to see people who live right. That made sense to me. What we're doing now does not make sense to me. I don't understand.
I'm 100% with you on this. The book I'm working on right now is looking at kind of evangelical involvement in social issues over the last 40, 50 years. And one of the things we introduced in my co-author and I, we want to share our life and community, prayer life, pietism, all of these kind of things that make us evangelicals from a spiritual, theological perspective. But in the last 40, 50 years, we ended up with a capital E evangelical, which is a very specific sociological political category. So a Wall Street Journal reporter was working on an article about multi-ethnic churches, called me for an interview, and I kind of asked her, hey, how did you get into this? She said, well, I'm not a Christian, I'm actually Jewish, but how did you get the evangelical? Very different now than it did 30, 40 years ago. Now, what's caught into the Christian worldview is anti-immigration, anti-Muslim, gun control. There's a whole lot of stuff that defines a Christian worldview that has nothing to do with Christianity. That explains Donald Trump for me. Because Trump, if you look at his human life as a Christian, it does not measure up to a Christian worldview. But there are certain things that we lumped into that Christian worldview, such as success in a capitalistic system. That's now part of the Christian worldview. Belief in lower taxes, belief in American greatness. That's now all part of a Christian worldview. That's not what it was 40 years ago. 40 years ago, it was high view of Scripture, high Christology, pietism, belief in holiness, all of these things that made a Christian worldview. Now if you ask, what does it mean to be a Christian candidate for the presidency, it has absolutely nothing to what we were talking about 30, 40 years ago.
I have one more question I'm going to ask in. A reminder, if you want to write questions down, just hold your sheet up. Everyone will get it. This next question is, I've seen a tendency for Christians to see horizontal reconciliation primarily as an individual process. How can we think about horizontal reconciliation structurally and systemically as Christians? And specifically, an example maybe on addressing systemic and institutional racism.
The best book in the whole world to read about this is called Divided by Faith. Have you read it yet? Anybody? Divided by Faith?
My provost.
Yes. I would say if you want to read anything other than what we've already talked about and the stuff we've tried to put out, it was written in 2000. It's called Divided by Faith, and it looks at the whole white evangelical movement and why our socialization theologically has lent us toward an individualistic understanding of social issues. It almost basically says that our understanding of faith has almost made it impossible for us to understand systemic injustice. So, because we have come to our faith through an individualistic understanding of our relationship with Jesus Christ. So our discipleship has been individualized through individual accountable free will individualism, right? Which basically says Jesus Christ is my personal Savior. Jesus Christ came into my life, my heart. That kind of thinking basically leads to when someone says race is a problem, then I say, I didn't do anything wrong. I am not a racist. I didn't own slaves. Do you follow? So our thinking, our literal theological lens has been such that from the day we came to faith, we understand it through an individualized belief system. And that belief system hinders our ability to think corporately. So we are generous people. We give to missions, but only if I individually feel called to do so. So systemic issues require a systemic approach. So something like healthcare to us feels like socialism, because if I want to give to that, or if I feel like I need healthcare, then I should be able to make that choice. And you also, because you have been created to have individual free will, you should also make the choice to save so you could get health care. It's not supposed to be something that's supposed to be a systemic or corporate process that we engage in. So our understanding of it theologically then impacts our sociological ability to address it. Does that make sense? So read Divided by Faith. Honestly, if you can, that would be for any evangelical. I'm an evangelical. For any evangelical, if you really truly want to understand what makes this so difficult for us, that book was life-changing for many of us.
And one of the more shocking assertions that was made is not that it actually prevents people from engaging in a corporate, it actually hinders. So it's actually working in the opposite direction. So what Emerson and Smith did was to point out it's not just making people not want to engage in the corporate racial justice story, it's actually keeping people from it. It's having the opposite effect because, as Brenda pointed out, the excessive individualism of our churches. And the example that I use is, again, I go to worship quite often. I was a worship leader for many years, and back in the day before these projectors, we used to have these bins with